So there we have it, Born to Kill, written by talmikal. You can follow along there, and let's get started. Harkon wasn't really sure how to lead this training. There had been no changes to the kit of the Royal Guard in over 15 generations. The troops standing before her didn't even have straps for this particular device. Logistics had to rush into tailors at tremendous cost, and for the time being, she was going to have to ask her troop to simply tie them to their weapons. Attention! As you may have heard, there have been reports of some unusual troops mixed in with the Klaxian forces. Klaxian, good name. These reports, while exaggerated, are accurate. A new species called the Terran have joined the Klaxian League, and per Article 14 of the Galactic Possession Conventions, the Klaxian are permitted to deploy one Terran per 2,500 troops. This is the maximum allowed due to their proportionally small population in the Klaxian League. Upon arrival to the designated battlefield, we can expect there to be 4 in total, as our Empire agreed to a 10,000 unit trial of conquest for the solar system. Although we have filed a formal objection to the Terran inclusion after the massacre at SDKG 48, the current trial of conquest cannot be postponed without forfeiting the system. Harkon didn't doubt the bravery of her troops. The Empire had gone to great lengths to ensure the rumors that had happened at SDKG-48 had been blown out of proportion. However, Harkon did not like the pale scales of her assembly. She had actually taken a moment prior to starting the presentation to brighten herself, using powders from her ceremonial kit. This was not going to be an easy speech. As you have heard, these Terrans do not utilize standard ablative armor or energy shields. We have obtained an example of what our analysts are calling heat-treated crystalline iron carbon. There is an additional layer of what appears to be a biofiber. However, the primary component is this steel, as we know it is called by the Terran forces. Harkon felt a great deal of shame, skipping the natural calcium crystal internal frame, but as there was nothing to offer on the subject, she had been instructed to keep that private after her briefing. Soldier! She motioned to the most confident colored troop she could see in the front rank. Behind me is a torso component of this steel. She pointed at the curiously shaped plate mounted to a block of structural frame. She tried to ignore the implications of it being almost her own height. I want you to fire your pulse rifle into it. Maximum yield. A joyful color in the veteran's scales, and a sudden burst of attention from the troops. Pulse rifles were expensive, and firing one at maximum yield was generally forbidden, as it was had an almost 40% failure rate. There was some serious debate over phasing out the ability that had been raging on for all of Harkon's career. The veteran crouched down and turned the setting past the safety clasp that snapped with an audible ping. Under normal conditions, that by itself would have been a court-martial. Harkon gave the nod, and the room went white. When the ringing stopped, Harkon noted that the rifle had indeed fused itself to its battery. She had to admit it was the first time she'd actually witnessed that function outside of recording. She took a deep breath and looked at the armor, half hoping her last briefing had been a sick joke. There were visible heat waves coming off the entire thing. It looked like the layer of color was gone, but in truth, the dull metallic shine looked even more defiant now, approaching it, as some of her troops were doing without her permission. She could even see the engraved markings that had not been altered. In an effort to regain order, she drew her officer's splint pistol. When she pulled the trigger, a thin sliver of ferrous metal was shaved off the ammunition block and sent slipping down the track at speeds so high that the 0.05 grams of mass produced enough recoil to make her insides lurch. There was a puff of ferrous dust and a flash of light where the splinter had exploded on the armor. Her class of guards snapped to attention, some visibly shaken, some visibly ashamed to have broken ranks without permission. What you did not hear about SDKG-48 was that almost 90% of our troops attempted an overload after engaging the Terran. Do not do that. There will be only 4 of them on the field, and they cannot be harmed by either pulse or splint. Almost all of the casualties we suffered were from regular troop engagements after our troops had destroyed their own primary arms. Murmurs of disbelief went through the ranks. To think that over 90,000 troops risked an overload was unthinkable. Given the unusual circumstances, Command decided not to punish the survivors, as they could not have known what you are all about to learn. This steel is manufactured in a 9.8 meters per second squared gravity well, and appears to involve other unique processes that we have not fully understood. If you're wondering when you're going to get your own set. She motioned to the technician to release the mount. The plate fell on its edge and buried itself almost its own thickness into the deck, sticking upright. Not until you can carry 6 times your own mass. Listen well. You are some of the finest troops of the Empire, and I think you deserve to know the truth. A Terran troop is a biped 2.7 times your height, and on average, when kitted out, outweighs you by a factor of 18. If we are to believe that the same 9.8 meters per second manufacturing conditions is also their homeworld standard, then they will be fighting at less than a third of their own standard. Reports from SDKG-48 suggest that this will allow them to jump over 25 meters, and they are fast. From what I've been told, they use absurdly powerful explosive kinetic weapons. Thanks to the size of their projectiles, they only carry 180 rounds, but they are very disciplined in how they spend them. After-action surveys estimate they scored almost 30% of their shots, and if you are hoping that your energy shields will stop their rounds, don't. We found that although it will stop the round, the force is still enough to rip your generator out of its housing and send the shield into you with enough force to shatter your exoskeleton. We are estimating the Terran unit will kill 208 of you before they run out of ammunition. Thankfully, their size does not allow them to use their allies or your own weapons when that happens. Total silence from the room. Thanks to the generations of relative parity during formal trial warfare, casualties were always high. The troops accepted this truth. Still, to lose over 200 Royal Guard to 4 of these monsters. Harkon needed to continue before she faltered. If you do your job and do not overload your weapon, we estimate a 40% chance to win this system. Furthermore, the mandatory truce period after the battle will buy us much-needed time to find a solution to future Klaxian conflicts involving Terran troops. I cannot stress this enough. Do not shoot at the Terran forces. It will only give away your position. And time spent shooting at them is the precious time that you're not shooting at the Klaxian regulars. Statistically, these are the greater threat to our victory. Legate Harkon? The same veteran that had fired earlier signaled a question. She couldn't help but notice all the color that had attracted her initially was gone. Go ahead, she motioned. What happens when we run out of ammunition? Harkon tried not to pause. They will attempt to squish you. The devices you are being issued are magnetic proximity detonators. If a Terran tries to squish you, the device will activate, and it is our hope that the concussive blast will disable them. Harkon could still see the images of the bodies from her briefings. She had decided an explanation would suffice rather than share those images. Besides, that's what her devices would prevent. It was grim calculus, but that was her job. Legate, you're issuing 10,000 royal guards with suicide bombs. Harkon gave the most sympathetic color she was able, no doubt her own false powdered color covering betrayed by such an act. After a long career of sending her empire's finest to their ends, this crossed a line she never knew existed. What choice do we have, trooper? Not a sound came from the assembled troops. There really was nothing to say. They would do their duty. She knew that, and so did they. The Empire wills it, she shouted. And we obey, thundered back, although more muted than she remembered hearing in the past. She stayed behind to stare at the now cool plate stuck to her parade deck. The briefing she had received did manage to approximate the meaning of the engraved symbols. Birth to end life, or something close. If that wasn't disturbing enough, she was told that it was engraved by the creature that wore it, using only a steel blade and its own strength. Standing alone besides the massive plate, she could see herself in the now reflective surface. All her natural color drained, the powdered layer looked absurd. A pathetic sight. How many of her comrades would see themselves like this after these monsters flew at them? Joining the other legates in the observation room, Harkon saw the others' somber colors. Among her own rank, the pretense of confidence she had kept for her troops could be abandoned. She had removed her powdered colors after seeing her reflection in a sample of Terran armor recovered from SDKG-48. Under normal circumstances, there was no need for close inspection of the battle situation. Trial combat rules did not permit any intervention or instruction from the forces outside orbit. All data would be meticulously logged for future analysis and to determine system royalties and battle salvage rights. Once the battle was over, both her own empire and the Klaxian, along with the neutral galactic third parties, would examine the battlefield and negotiate the ratios of ownership for the solar system. All rather routine, however, the size and quality of the observation teams from all three parties were comically disproportionate to the value of the system. Everyone assembled here wanted to see the 4 Terran troops that were joining the Klaxian regulars. This would be the second deployment of Terran troops in history, and already they had caused an unprecedented and rapid alteration to the carefully balanced systems her empire had been using for generations. Including proximity mines with her own legion units was, even in the event of victory, going to cause a huge economic penalty to the lease of the system. She had personally had to justify her request to her empire's legal teams only days prior to entering the system. As a half measure, they permeated only her own legion to equip them. Harkon was deeply worried this was a mistake, but had expended all her military clout even to procure 1,000 mines. An audible tone informed her and the other 9 legates that pre-battle deployments were almost completed and that the total information would soon be available. Thanks to shared transponder data, observers would have razor-sharp views of the battle. As instructed, the Empire had deployed 9 legions in a bow-shaped line to engage the Klaxian. Harkon's own legion was behind the center of the bow and had been instructed to reinforce wherever the Terran forces appeared. If they repeated their actions on SDKG-48, they would charge through the line and cause total chaos behind the main engagement. Previously, this had caused panic, and troopers had tried to down the Terrans using a dangerous overload of their pulse rifles. As a consequence, the Klaxian regulars were able to massacre the disarmed Empire troops. This would not happen again. All troops had been instructed to ignore the Terrans and allow Harkon's legions to engage the Terrans until they ran out of ammunition. Experience had taught them that they would then attempt what they called melee. Barbaric but brutally effective tactics that the Empire historians had to brief the military on after consulting records archived in the Galactic Library. It was after that history lesson Harkon came up with the proximity mines. The morality of it was repulsive, the technology crude, but it was the only solution anyone could come up with on such short notice. It was agreed this tactic would only ever be used until a more palatable countermeasure could be found. Another tone signaled total information was online. As expected, the Klaxion was deployed in a staggered line. Due to the bow shape, Empire forces were already at a disadvantage due to their shorter battle line. Both flank legions were prepared for this and had entrenched themselves in the limited pre-battle stage. None of this came as a surprise to anyone in the room, and immediately everyone accessed the Klaxion battle roster and filtered it by species. Disaster. The Terrans were not together as they had done previously. They were seemingly randomly sprinkled across their line. Harkon's Centurions would have to break her legion and engage in 4 locations, but without the intel she had access to, they had no way to know this. Any hope of ground observers being able to identify the problem in time to organize a response was dashed when all 4 Terran units charged. Harkon had highlighted all 4 of them on her system map. She had seen data from SDKG-48, but the speed was no less shocking to her. 4th Legion hadn't finished charging their rifles before a Terran was inside the meta border of the Legion. Unit lights were blinking out on every data packet received. Harkon opened the optical probe views of the 4th Legion grid, and a steady tick of photos showed the shadows of the Terrans blinking between the craters on the moon. Some bright points indicated the Legion troops had already begun overloading their rifles. Futile, but she couldn't blame them. Even from the comfort of orbit, she was starting to miss key data points trying to understand what was happening. A pause to collect herself and remember that she could do nothing to help her troops other than observe and prepare for future battles. She looked at the 2nd, 5th, and 7th Legion grids to see the same situation unfolding in each. No doubt her own Legion would soon advance on 5th's grid, incorrectly assuming that it held all 4 of their avatars of these avatars of death. More concerning, if that was even possible, was that the Klaxians were advancing almost unchallenged. As the legions tried to deal with the carnage among the entrenchments, there was no time to fend off the regulars. Over 4% of the 10,000-strong deployments were dead or dying. She had no way of knowing how many had destroyed their own rifles, but the optical map suggested hundreds, if not 1,000. The entrenched 1st and 9th were being totally bypassed as the Klaxians abandoned the formation to rush the center. An hour later, any semblance of order was gone. As Harkon predicted, her own 10th Legion had rushed to 5th's right flank. In a cruel irony, the Terrans appeared to think this was some sort of critical point in the battle rather than a trap. All 4 of them converged on the grid, literally shattering a path as they went. They had all apparently run out of ammunition in the first 7 minutes of the battle. The melee tactics caused even more panic among the Empire troops, and pulse rifle overloads could be seen unaided from orbit. The Terrans figured out the proximity mines after one unit set off 3 in a row while stomping on the Legionnaires. Each blast sent the unit a dozen meters in the air with brutal force. The biped could still be seen sitting upright after the last blast seemed to bypass its endurance. Another Terran had come to its aid, and after some communication appeared to have discerned how to identify the mines. The 3 remaining Terrans simply stopped engaging the 10th Legion units and started throwing other Legion units, or pieces of units, at them. The force occasionally even set off the mines. There was no way to tell how many the Terrans had killed. If pressed, Harkon would estimate 400 to 600 over the course of the battle. In total, less than 900 had survived the ceasefire. The Klaxians had again swarmed over disorganized and unarmed troops. As a force multiplier, these Terrans were unprecedented. Harkon had actually tasked one of the optical sensors to look at the Terran's habitat crudely attached to the Klaxian transport. These post-battle periods usually involved networking with peers, arms dealers, system trade delegates, and logistics corporations. Network traffic was simply bombarding the Terran habitat, An automated system was directing all the traffic to the appropriate Klaxian contact. These Terrans seemed to have no interest in galactic trade or politics. In fact, after a shuttle had returned, the 4 Terrans deployed there had seen no activity at all from the ugly box attached to the sleek hull of the modified Klaxian transport. A whispered question from a totally gray legate interrupted her thoughts. "So what are you going to do, legate?" All 9 of her peers had huddled around her after she had received a call from the ship's communications officer. The Terran battle barge, as her fleet had started calling the Cursed Tumor, had hailed the 10th Legion's deployment ship directly and requested to speak with its commander. After a flurry of objections and multiple demands that a more senior Empire personnel be selected, the voice of the Terran battle barge had made it abundantly clear that an invitation to Harkon, and only Harkon, was being extended. This was not to be an official diplomatic meeting, and no recording devices of any kind would be permitted. A Klaxian transport had been dispatched to ferry her over at her convenience. The Klaxian shuttle pilot had curiously informed her that she was to select from a menu. Apparently, she was being offered a choice of meal during her visit. If the list she had been given was accurate, this Terran ship had a stock of some of the finest food in her empire. They even claimed to have royal jelly. Harkon had never even been in the same room as royal jelly. "I guess I'll try the jelly and Telvian nectar," Harkon answered, stunned. Again, the Terrans had caused a total collapse of order among the Empire, this time using nothing but an invitation. Meeting among combatants after a trial of conquest was not unusual. Harkon had personally met with the Klaxians on multiple occasions. As their 2 species were very similar culturally, they often viewed one another as friends. The fact that they clashed hundreds of times in the past was simply a matter of proximity and necessity. Both species were uniquely suited to ground combat, and were paid rather well to represent both their own and others' interests across the galaxy. Maintaining a standing military presence in the galaxy, either yourself or by paying another race to do it on your behalf, was a time-honored practice that ensured security at the galactic core. There was no true animosity among the races past a healthy rivalry, but these Terrans had utterly crushed them for the second time. Worse, they didn't even follow their own initial doctrine. Upon learning of the invitation to dine being offered to a lowly legate while refusing to even answer hails from the royal family, the entire fleet was in disarray. In an effort to preserve dignity, they had resisted the urge to swarm Harkon's observation ship with shuttles, but the facilities on board were simply not equipped to perform the hundreds of tasks being asked. Besides, most of these tasks were conflicting to begin with. The Merchants Guild had demanded she present an industry trade list to her hosts. The military was instructing her to wear a full ceremonial dress, despite her being tragically underranked for such extravagance. She didn't even think there was a platinum mandible cover in the solar system. She had less than an hour before her shuttle was to depart. Ultimately, it was decided that this was a personal invitation, although she was being ordered to attend. She would have full discretion on what that meant. Maximum responsibility and minimal control. The story of any legate's career. Harkon decided to use that time to requisition a new uniform and some assistance in molting slightly ahead of schedule. There had been some serious debate about wearing her officer's splint pistol, but Harkon had exercised the discretion offered to her and outright refused, partially out of protocol and also because of if the Terran ship was running at anything close to 9.8 meters per second squared gravity, the pistol would pin her to the ground the moment she stepped off the shuttle. Her ship did happen to have a grooming attendant on board, and the ranking officer on the ship insisted she be given a full pattern of colored powder. A quick shot of fermented nectar to calm the pheromones, and Harkon was escorted to the waiting Klaxian shuttle. Disappointingly, the shuttle was crewed by 2 Klaxians, wasting the time of every ranking officer crowding the airlock. The co-pilot was polite enough and even assisted her in stepping onto the ship. After she was secured and they were underway, she attempted to speak with the pilot. So, have either of you actually met these Terrans? A brief delay for the ship to translate. No, Legate. They don't get out much. There are a few stewards on that habitat of theirs, but they don't talk about what goes on there. Harkon tried to keep them going, more to calm herself than any real purpose. What's with that configuration, anyhow? It looks like it's just mounted to a 408 EST. That's exactly what it is. They don't have extrasolar transit. Or at least they don't have enough to spare for these trials. Rumor has it we tried to convert some ships for them, but the gravity systems just couldn't be pushed that hard without a total refit. The pilot chimed in. That, and we would have had to cut out every second deck for height, every third if we wanted them comfortable. Harkon was having some regrets about not taking a bit more of that nectar. Listen, we are going to be able to take you on board. We aren't going to be able to take you on board. We are going to wait for you at the docking collar. Take as much time as you need. The shuttle went into a tight little roll and locked colors. Okay. We are here to take it real slow when you step on. And whatever you do, don't jump. If you have anything you can take off, do it now. Harkon reluctantly took off her outer layer with all its pinned adornments. She really should have just worn training silk weave. She wasn't sure how Terrans felt about the excreted fibers, though. Stepping off of the shuttle, she was relieved to find the docking room was a stasis, 3.54 meters per second squared. Her invitation had assured her the climate would be able to sustain her without any danger, although the pressure would require a decompression cycle when she left. Waiting in the room was yet another Klaxian. Welcome, Legate. I am Steward Tally. If you would follow me, I will take you to the Specialist Chen's quarters. Specialist? Is this Chen a civilian? Harkon knew enough Klaxians to know what that posture meant. Total lack of further knowledge. They are all ranked as specialists. They all outrank us, but can't order us. They request things. Ask them to do something, and they will usually do it. Order them to do something, and they usually won't. Klaxian hierarchy was legendary among the galaxy. That statement alone had made Harkon's mind cloud, and would be picked apart for days after she debriefed. The Klaxian extended a limb and transferred a remote while motioning to a platform rover. You're welcome to transit the habitat under your own power, but I request you use this gravity pad during your visit. The gravity pad was worth more than a prime chamber on her homeworld. Harkon boarded the pad and watched Tally board her own. To the side of the chamber, there were 4 more parked. As she directed her pad through the next airlock, the hall before her was at least 5 times her own height. She felt like she was entering the kingdom of a god. The excitement of the day's events had almost let her forget that over 95% of her own legion was dead. The materials of the hallway seemed to share the reflective properties of the monolithic armored plate that had so far been the closest she had been to a Terran. Even with her full powder cover, a Klaxian would be able to tell she was frightened. This was the kingdom of demons, birthed to end life. Those symbols may as well have been carved onto her optical pods. How many Terrans are in the habitat, Tally? Harkon was sure there was more urgency in that question than she had intended. There was visible discomfort showing on Tally's faceplate. Harkon outranked the steward. Of this she was certain. Even if a Klaxian was recently in a combat zone, Her empire and their league were back to their same galactic military the moment a trial ended. She was culturally and legally obligated to answer her questions. The Terrans do not wish to disclose that information. Currently, they are designated as private citizens and have decided details like that are protected as merchants' trade secrets. That answer had come fast enough that it clearly wasn't the first time that it had been used. Harkon could think of about a dozen reasons that the statement wouldn't hold up in a court hearing, but this poor Klaxian looked like it wanted to roll into a ball. Excuse me. Harkon had to at least make an effort to learn something here. Her debriefing was going to be painful if she didn't come back with something other than a full digestive tract. I understand, but that means this ship isn't registered as military. So what is it registered as? Both Tally and her own gravity pad halted in the middle of the massive corridor. Are you a lawyer, Legate? Harkon swore that the question sounded helpful. Or hopeful. No, but I am a trial possession legate. Law is a big part of my job. Tally looked disappointed. Well, these Terrans are... I think they all are. Even the hatchlings. Especially the hatchlings. This isn't a ship. It has renovated docking clamps and no means of self-propulsion. It's a cargo container, and its contents are protected by the Merchant's Trade Secrets subsection. Also, because they permanently attached a medical archive to the exterior of the hull, it's a private medical record. Like the entire... not a ship. Tally resumed the platform's journey and seemingly telepathically answered Harkon's half-formed question before she had finished forming it in her mind. You can't ask why they bolted a medical archive to a cargo container's exterior. That's covered by the Cultural Landmarks Office, and must be answered by one of their own officers. Between you and me, I don't think they have any cultural landmark officers. Stopping again, Tally motioned to the door in front of them. This isn't an elevator. It's a mechanical medical filling tube that will take you to the specialist Chen's deck. Your platform will take you to her quarters automatically. Please do not attempt to step off your platform without considering the gravity. Good luck, Legate. Don't let the hatchling grab you. What hatchling? The door closed before she had a chance to finish. What was clearly an elevator seemed to know where it was going, but Harkon did not have a chance to let her optical translator have a look at the deck labels. She had come from the docking and storage deck. There appeared to be a deployment stage below her. A deployment staging deck below her. But everything else looked to be civilian. Literally storage and educational deck. Recreational outdoor simulation deck. The aquatic deck and several decks she assumed were quarters. Before she had a chance to figure out why there were no bridge, the door opened and her platform pressed on. Evidently, Chen's quarters were near the end of this, whatever this structure was. Passing several doors, Harkon could see they were labeled. Passing several doors, Harkon could see they were labeled in similar markings as the engraving she had seen days earlier. When the platform reached the door, an audible ping came from inside. A muffled noise passed through the door in Harkon's body. Her translator had been updated during the shuttle ride, but seemed to be thinking rather hard. Enter. Dual meaning, dual recipients, clarity, error. Before Harkon could figure out what to do, the door opened and all hopes of dignified introduction were abandoned. A Terran approximately her own height was charging her and screaming a war cry that let her own sensory organs see her internal structure from the outside in. The Terran would be on top of her before she could jump off the platform. Even assuming that the fall didn't kill her, the Terran obviously would. By some miracle, the Terran stumbled and started to fall, making almost no attempt to protect itself and maintaining eye contact as it went down. It fell on its face. At speeds impossible to her own species, but slow enough to comprehend, another creature materialized next to the charging monster. At least 3 times the size of the homicidal demon had caught it. It caught it mid-fall and lifted it into its own frame, or onto its own frame. Tones of pure bass felt more than heard again washed through her as she positioned her body to find the top of the giant that had saved her life. "Hello, Harkon. Sorry about that. This is Lucas. Say hello, Lucas." The creature that had tried to kill her motioned with its upper limb. "Hello, hello, hello." Repetition error. Speech is infantile. A hatchling. A decorated legate of the Empire had considered leaping onto a gravity deck that would have turned her insides into a liquid just to avoid meeting the charge of a hatchling. With no idea what her color was at the moment, Archon straightened her thorax and presented herself. No apologies needed, Specialist Chen. I am Legate Harkon. Greetings, hatchling Lucas." The hatchling continued to its rapid waving gesture with the same limb that had threatened to rip her off her platform a moment ago, eyes still locked to her despite Chen's gyrating bounce. "Oh, I'm her husband, Renee. She is in the kitchen trying to figure out... She's in the kitchen trying to figure out your jelly." Again, the bass filled the room as Renee doubled his initial volume. "She's here, babe." "Just a moment, Harkon. Make yourself comfortable. I'm going to give this guy a hibernation ritual before dinner." "Oh, nap." Harkon didn't have time to answer before the giant seemed to comfortably glide away, carrying a hatchling that might have been 3 times her own weight. It was deeply unsettling how its head seemed to have locked onto her location without effort, adjusting to its carrier's rapid movement. Using the lull in activity, Harkon absorbed the implication of what had just happened. There were at least 2 drone males in his dwelling. Specialist Chen must have been some sort of broodmother. She had been given access to a broodmother's private chambers. This had not happened since she was an egg. The hatchling's murder charge must have been instinctive. Who knew how many other hatchlings might be in the walls of this chamber? It was impressive that the adult drone had the sentient control to not only save her life and exchange greetings, but resist the instinct to kill her where she stood. The entire structure was a hive. They had brought a hive into orbit and transported it to a conflict zone. That hatchling showed her they truly were birthed to end life, but it seemed they grew into something more restrained. This is a bit rough to read, I'll be honest. Soon a Terran broodmother would return from the feeding chamber, and Harkon would be face to face with not just a Terran, but the queen of this hive. There were stories from long before her species had left orbit of the ancient battles fought to the heart of a hive. To stand in another hive's birthing chamber was the dream of any grub selected for military service. This Terran had invited her in without so much as a security scan. Of course, Harkon wouldn't dream of trying to harm her, as that would have been outlawed by both her own species and every civilized race eons ago. No, Harkon must be mistaken. This couldn't be a queen. Maybe one of her fertile daughters sent to command this campaign. Still, an unfathomable honor, but not utter madness. Harkon herself was the spawn of a minor daughter. Her mother would have never permitted an audience with anyone but her own mother. Any foolish dreams of carrying a broodmother's head back to her own hives, like the stories she was raised with, were gone the moment Specialist Chen came striding out of the kitchen. Curiously, it was slightly smaller than the male drone that had stopped the hatchling moments ago. This creature was still 3 times her size, but seemed slender. Stranger, st- sorry, stranger still, she was walking under her own legs with no chamber drones assisting her. She must be incredibly young given her size. She must be incredibly young given her size compared to the hatchling. What was that smell? The broodmother was carrying something that was making Harkon's mandibles ache. She had to start swallowing drool before it shot out of her mouth. Harkon, I'm so happy you came. Again, the bass filled the air. Harkon couldn't tell if Chen was sprinting, but the speed she was approaching her platform was shocking. Queen Broodmother Chen of the Terran, congratulations on your victory. May your brood grow across the stars. Harkon assumed her message and her own head would be sufficient tribute to conclude whatever bizarre surrender ceremony was underway here. Chen abruptly stopped and tapped what looked like a translator on her wrist against her own chin. An awkward maneuver, as her upper limbs were carrying some sort of tray. In the awkward silence, Harkon became aware that she had in fact drooled on herself. Worse, the broodmother was turning red, almost universally a bad sign across the races. Harkon, can you hear me? I think our translators are mismatched. That was very formal. This needed to be saved immediately. Insulting another race's broodmother was grounds for war. A war Harkon did not envision would end well for her empire. Yes, Queen Broodmother Chen. The fault is certainly with me. Harkon, can we forego the formalities? My name is Womberi Chen, Bei for short. Or Wombei Chen, Bei for short. Can I adjust your platform for you? I can't imagine you are very comfortable. Before Harkon could answer, Bei had with grace and speed shifted herself onto one of her only two legs and used the free one to tap a button underneath Harkon's platform. She did all this without putting down the tray of whatever treasure was making that smell. With a gentle push, the platform ascended 2 times her own height, and she was head-to-head with Bei, who was, without a doubt, a shade of red she had not been when exiting the kitchen chamber. To her shame, Harkon winced in preparation for the death blow. Only then could she see the contents of the tray. Sealed in silk composite, and marked with the stamp of her empire, was an entire cell of royal jelly. Queen Broodmother, is that for me? Harkon had retracted her second eyelid to get a better look, and although the pressure of the ship was painful, she was in no hurry to close them. Only if you start calling me Bei. Pulsating bass, mirth, laughter. Just Bei. Her volume briefly stunned Harkon's pressure senses, but it seemed to have been a friendly gesture. And you need to tell me how to open this. The packaging is so pretty, I don't want to do it wrong. They couldn't get the Telvian nectar you asked for, so I asked the steward for the next best thing. Bottles are on the table. So is what I think is an opener. Help yourself and me. Mirth, laughter. First contact, and you asked for the hard stuff. I like your style, Harkon. I told the shuttle crew not to wait up. Bei revealed a wide set of white crushing organs hidden behind her mouth. To her horror, Bei almost threw down the jelly onto a table where a piercing alarm came from the feeding chamber, tapped Harkon's platform, causing it to drift towards the table, and ran back to the room she had come from. That was real running. Whatever speed had happened prior was not. That was the speed that a Terran in full battle armor in a Legion's perimeter... that was the speed that had put a Terran in full battle armor into a Legion's perimeter before a shot was fired. It's all good. I can fix this. Open those bottles. Harkon didn't want the bottles. She didn't want anything but the jelly that was cruelly just out of her reach. Maybe an explanation as to what the hell was going on, but mostly just the jelly. 9.8 meters per second squared, only a meter at most. She could make it if she told herself. Standing at the edge of the platform, Harkon reached over the side to test her reach, There was a tingle on the border of the gravity bubble. She felt the intense sensation of weight as her limb continued to reach forward. Even if she could extend all the way, she wasn't even close to reaching. She would have to jump and try to land on the table without breaking her exoskeleton. A blur of pale flesh snapped her out of her madness. The hatchling was back. Stripped of its previous garments and wet, it had no shame. Only the same homicidal stare was this time on her cell of jelly. Panic set in until she realized there was no way the hatchling could reach across the table. Mercifully, her own platform was also well out of its kill range. Unless it could jump. Could it jump? Deities, miracle conception, reanimated male hatchling. Lucas, at least let me get you a droppings snack. Sorry again, Harkon. He's almost done. Say good night, Lucas. The drone's voice came flowing about the chamber as he retreated to earlier. Flowing out of the chambers he had retreated to earlier? Okay. The hatchling walked away on its own, but this time waved its upper limb at the jelly, eyes never losing lock till it left the chamber. Coming to her senses, Harkon managed to use the remote given to her by the steward to maneuver the platform to face the hatchling chamber. The platform wouldn't allow her over the table, but would get her in reach of the bottles she had been ordered to open. The opener might even give her a chance if the hatchling came back. The nectar on the table wasn't from a planet she was familiar with, but the bottles looked expensive. The level of fermentation and the number of bottles were enough to kill her several times over. She would need to pace herself without insulting her host. She managed to open 2 before Bay came gliding back again with a tray. Hope you like well done. Laughter. Shame. Normally masked by her translator, these Terran voices were distracting, able to be felt through the translations. Some sort of burnt protein with vegetation, Harkon discerned visually. You can safely eat this domestic, mostly flightless creature. Flightless flying creature. I checked the stewards and the database. Apparently, Bay was able to read facial cues because she immediately detected confusion. Sorry, try this. Bay placed a small device on the table and turned it to face Harkon. An optical projector flashed, and brief feedback as her own translator was bypassed. Harkon's military-issued translator cracked as if it belonged to the Terran. Huh. The optical translation portion of her view displayed a new interface. Introduction screen. Loading. Salandro Tutor. License restricted use. The Salandro was one of the oldest races in the galaxy. Their biology made it possible to leave their single planet without enormous expense. They were some of the finest software engineers among the 1,000 races. A Salandro Tutor AI was a treasure afforded only to the wealthiest. Using one as a simple translator was a display of wealth and power intended to inspire awe. It worked. Bay now had 2 items on her table that showed Harkon that she was every bit a broodmother. Chicken, Bay repeated. This time the word was clear. Harkon could see the chicken and hear its noises, and she could somehow even smell it. Amazed, she looked back to Bay. Now her own face was clear. The red was an embarrassment. The mouth parting was friendship. Her eyes cared about Harkon's opinion on the chicken. I would love to try your burnt chicken, Bay, but can I first have that jelly? I just about jumped off my platform while you were gone. Laughter. Promise not to call me Queen Broodmother again. Harkon expressed her joy in her own way, and the laughter grew louder. Now she could feel and understand it. This was going to be the most interesting meal Harkon had ever had. Cheers. The bottle, she wanted to drink the bottle. But after banging them together, Harkon took the bottle and let Bay tap hers on her own. Bay's hand was so large, only 2 fingers held onto the bottle while Harkon struggled to hold hers outside the gravity boundary. The speed and grace that had seemed so unnerving moments ago was this time employed by Bay to catch Harkon's bottle with surprising tenderness, guide her back to the safety of her platform. "Terrans are warm," Harkon blurted out. Again, Bay blushed. Harkon inexplicably knew both the word, meaning, and the cause. "There are many things you don't know about us. That's why I invited you over. The galaxy is so strange to us. We are trying our best to adapt. But your suicide devices, Harkon." Bay was sad. Harkon now knew this, and the feeling was too much. I and so many others knew this would happen. This idea of civilized war to end wars. It's worked for so long, we can't imagine how, but it's working. Terrans are going to change things in ways none of you are prepared for. I've tried to talk with Calaxians, but they don't understand. Harkon changed her color to match her shame. The mines. This is about the mines. Bay went quiet and emptied her tiny bottle. Harkon took a moment and a long pull of her own. This AI tutor was flooding her with the nuance of what Bay had just said. Bay wasn't angry. She was sad, not for herself, but for Harkon. Something primal came out of Harkon. She didn't need this broodmother's pity. The devices didn't fail. They simply hadn't used enough of them. If her empire had listened to her and equipped all 10 legions, things would have been different. Her sisters might not have won the field, but it would have been closer. Their contract would have awarded far more of the system's economic output to their employers. The loss would have cost her own hive deeply. Billions of tons of protein would have been diverted to more successful broods. A generation of larvae would have to hibernate for lack of resources. Another loss like this would have, and those same larvae might have to feed the grubs. You're right. We were not prepared, but next time we will be. I killed one of your soldiers this time, and next time we will be even stronger. My brood won't be driven underground, just so yours can travel the stars. The sound shook her entire jaw like an explosion. Something Harkon hadn't done in her entire life had just happened. She had snapped her mandibles together in a show of dominance. That was an action only used to inform a nursing caste that a princess was demanding obedience. It was rage, fermented nectar, and the smell of that jelly. It may have been the stupidest action of her life. She had just challenged a mature queen for control of her own hive. Bay didn't even flinch. Patel? The translator fed Harkon a name. Terran, a picture, an age. He isn't dead. Very injured, but not dead. I'm going to be working with him a lot. Did you know he was the one that figured out the mines? Bad luck, really. Of the 44 draftees on board, he just happened to be from the region in the South Pacific that had seen a lot of them recently. First one in his entire country to leave orbit, traveled 1,000 light years, all to be blown up over some H3 mining lease agreement. Bay opened another bottle without using the opener, just snapping it like a protein ration. Without looking at Harkon, she did the same for the royal jelly and placed it on Harkon's tray. I read your Empire's last combat submission. They were doubling the yield and proposing to equip all Terran/Calaxian hybrid engaged legions with them. Not just the 10,000 or 100,000 size trials either. All of them. That's how it starts. Now Bay turned to look at her, eyes wet. The AI slapped Harkon with sorrow. Bay pulled up a hologram of a Terran unit clad in armor and holding those cannons they had used. 18,232 battle points. Then an image of a mine came up at 1,209 battle points. Harkon was shocked to see that the mine was obviously double the yield. These Terrans had better intel on their own military than she did. 1,209 points. Do you know why Patel was carrying 180 rounds of ammunition? Harkon could see where this was going. The points limit on the contract. We just gave you a 7% budget boost. You are going to spend it on ammunition. You are going to spend it on ammunition. Who knows what the Klaxians will spend it on? 6.74% flashed in her vision. The AI tutor apparently lacked some tact. Harkon was clawing deep in her jelly, but she could hardly take her eyes off the projection. Secondary energy shields for the Klaxian. You're going to have to boost your pulse gun rate of fire and yield. That's going to cost you another 1,000 points at least. Good guess on the ammunition, but the only reason we're using caseless ammo was to fit in the armor budget. That 7% will let us use variations of your own splinter shaving system. Basically, limitless ammunition. Escalation, Harkon. We showed up, and in less than 4 years, we have caused a galaxy-wide escalation. How long is everyone going to play by these perfect rules if we keep this up? This was all too much, and the tutor's interface combined with the jelly was making her head spin. Bay had just revealed her hive stratagem to a war race legate, and cast doubt on eons worth of stability in a single speech. Click. It wasn't voluntary. The emotion of the realization was just too much. She needed a break. A scream came from the chamber the hatchling had retreated to earlier. Harkon briefly assumed it was going to come to answer the challenge she had issued to its mother, but the tutor told her it was a distress call. Bay stood up. We probably woke him up. I don't know. I know that was a lot to dump on you. Want to take a breather and help me put him down? Asking a stranger to tend your young for you after that stranger just threatened to end your hive should have been humiliating to an extreme, but Harkon couldn't say no to this creature. The AI showed how tired her face was, even a brief lesson on the dark sacs of her eyes. Harkon indicated agreement and directed her platform to follow Bay deeper into the hive. Not knowing what she expected, but sure that it wasn't this, Harkon took the time to study the hive's inner sanctum. The evolutionary quirk still let her mentally snap an interior in great detail. The entire structure was basically just a rectangle with a few compartmental chambers. The main room and the kitchen, with what appeared to be 3 more chambers down the tunnel. She could hear the hatchling in one and smell water in the other. The furthest chamber was much larger, assuming this was a rectangle. Following Bay into the hatchling storage chamber, she saw the male drone had collapsed on the floor. Likely, he had finished his matting cycle and was in his death stage. Perhaps the hatchling would consume him later. Harkon was sad he hadn't stayed with her longer when they had first met. She hadn't even had the chance to thank him for saving her life. Don't mind him. He can sleep through anything. He had a rough day. He is the primary surgeon on board. Spent all day going over the techniques he's going to need for Patel after his swelling is under control. Bay captured the hatchling, who was pacing in its cage. This little guy, on the other hand, likes to wake up for a song or two. Harkon couldn't say how long she stayed in the chamber. She had apparently finished all the jelly while watching Bay vibrate the hatchling with her speech organs. The song had helped Harkon through her intense reaction to the jelly. The smell had been overpowering, but actually eating it was making her dizzy. Thankfully, the hatchling hardly seemed to be aware of the intruder in its chambers. Let's go, Bay mouthed without sound, and the tutor indicated her meaning. Harkon's head was swimming, but she managed to guide her platform out of the room without disturbing the drone or the hatchling. Back at the table, inebriation allowed for candor. Harkon simply asked Bay what she was, and the tutors somehow made the question coherent to her host. Bay seemed to know where to start, wiped the drool off her shoulder, and began. Well, first of all, I'm no queen brood mother or whatever it is your translator keeps saying. A brood of 3, just Lucas, Renee, and myself here. We are part of the support staff for the draftees. Renee is a doctor, so am I. Bay laughed. I have 2 doctorates, one in trauma physiology and another in neuroscience, and I don't think anyone has called me doctor since we left Seoul. They call me Shrink. I was part of the team that developed the enhanced emotional combat therapy device, and my job here is to help the draftees cope from the combat-related trauma and develop new techniques for future draftees. The tutor was making a heroic effort to make this clear to Harkon, but it had its limits. Harkon now knew in vague terms Bay was able to produce offspring, but only in very limited fashion, and that her mate wasn't a half-genome drone, but a very talented healer. Bay was an extremely specialized healer, but of the mind and was sent here to learn new healing techniques. So your troops are not troops? Harkon was now very puzzled. Yes and no. It's very complicated. Bay this time snapped 2 bottles open in one hand and offered one to Harkon. When she declined, Bay finished them both in rapid succession before continuing. We have had to have enough eligible troops for the Klaxian to be able to justify including us to the Galactic War Organization. I understand your empire uses less than 2% of your military personnel, and from that 2%, the random selection only takes something like a quarter. Well, we needed to include 73% of the entire globe just to make the eligibility cutoff. Every man, woman, and depending on your standards, child over age of 17. There was some pushback from certain pacifist religions and more patriarchy-centered cultures about the inclusion of some groups, but we were in no state to turn down the aid the Klaxian had to offer. New loopholes this time, in theory. A world leader's 17-year-old daughter might die on a moon, and their 70-year-old father might die with her. One single draft irregularity could compromise our species' eligibility for official participation in galactic trials. You said your brood wouldn't go back underground, Harkon. Well, mine already was when the Klaxian found us. Our ecosystem was in ruins. India and China had just finished a thermonuclear war over the Himalayan water table. Turns out you don't need fresh water when people that needed it are turned into ash. No one needed salt water. We had plenty of that drowning the coasts that were the home to half the remaining population. There wasn't a drop of oil left in the reasonable access areas. We were using fission plants to cool down entire cities, just to keep going. Another 2 bottles went down, and Bay didn't even offer one this time. Harkon wasn't a scientist, but the idea of trying to cool your crust using nuclear fire. Harkon was sure the tutor had made a mistake about the atmospheric thermal weapons being deployed. So, we cut a deal. A global draft of 73% of 9 billion people, just to squeak past the regulation and enable us to participate in your tidy little games. Of the eligible draft, only 4 million would actually get the call. To us, 4 million was a rounding error during a dust famine. We killed off 10 times that just to consolidate consensus and take the Klaxian offer. It's not their fault, Harkon. We had nothing else to trade. Our entire solar system is a worthless backwater. That's why it took so long for anyone to find us. Bay looked to her chicken in disgust, and then tore a chunk off of it and ate it barehanded. This chicken probably had to be cloned after the fusion power came online. We used to eat algae, chicken for soldiers. We have done worse for less, I suppose. Lucas will grow up with chicken to eat. That's worth a lot to me. Harkon found it a little unnerving to hear the crunching of black carbon. Once they saw what they could do, they gave us everything. Fusion power, atmospheric cleaners, and food aid. Hell, we would have done it for just the clean water. We sold what was left of our souls, and the worst part was we got a better deal than we deserved. Bae seemed like she had been talking more to herself than to Harkon until her bloodshot eyes locked onto Harkon. You want to see what you're up against? What I built? I can show you. I'm not supposed to, but I can do it. Bae's speech was getting slurred, and the tutor was having a hard time now. Even drunk, she was so fast Harkon didn't have time to stop her as she activated the tutor. Harkon's visual input expanded to her entire vision. She was blind. She could still hear Bae, but she sounded so far away. Enhanced emotional combat therapy. Sounded better when I wrote it. Let me show you what we are selling, what the Klaxians bought. Buyer beware, right? No refunds. What a joke. Harkon was now staring at an assembly of Klaxian warriors blanketed in a dust storm kicked up from departing dropship thrusters. She saw almost the entire deployment scattered along the forming front line. She could actually feel the pings of tiny rocks hitting the back of her helmet and hear the tapping sound as they bounced off. She must have been almost 2 meters tall to be able to see all these Klaxians. The closest ones couldn't bend their heads far enough to meet her gaze. Some sort of communication device drowned out the dust storm. Anyone else getting nervous when they stare at us like this? A female voice cut in. Look at you three, the most eligible bachelors on whatever the fuck rock with 20,000 lonely ladies. Wave to all the pretty girls, Patel. The tutor was still augmenting this simulation. Moldy was an Australian. Patel loved her like an older sibling. Moldy? Harkon was getting stuck into the bottomless pit of the tutor's attempts to explain questions as they formed. 20,000? I thought you said not if I was the last man on Earth, Specialist Moldy. How about a moon? More laughter this time. 3 voices and Harkon's avatar in unison. Harkon figured it out. She was Patel. She could experience everything he had in some sort of recording. She tried to tell Bae, but found she couldn't even feel her own mandibles. Only what must have been at least 30 rock-like crushers. Terrans were not warm. They were burning from the inside. She could feel heat pushing back against the cold of her armor. Her internal frame was driving the crushing weight at himself and his armor into the hardened dust below. She could actually feel the compacted dust cracking with each step, while the Klaxians seemed to be dancing on the surface. A much older voice came in. It was their patriarch, a 64-year-old grandfather they called Gramps. Harkon now understood they had no drones. The male who Patel trusted implicitly was a father of a father. If such a thing existed in the Empire, he would be the queen of another queen. Harkon felt the responsibility Patel had for him. Age had slowed him, and he shouldn't have been here. Patel would see that nothing harmed him. Okay, kiddos, back to work. Split up as we talked about. When we get the green light, get in range and wiggle your bachelor asses for the ladies. You to Moldy, we don't judge here. We want them shooting at us, not our little friends here. I'll give you all a shiny gold star for each overload you can bait out of them. Take your shots nice and slow, but bring the ruckus. Wu-Tang Clan ain't nothing to fuck with. The tutor didn't even attempt whatever that was. Laughter from the four of them again, and all of a sudden, Harkon was moving, literally flying across the field. Most of Patel's energy was being spent trying to crash into the Klaxian, who was offering a feeding gesture to Patel as he flew past him. They had timed that maneuver perfectly. The battle had started right when Patel had got to the outermost edge of the grid. Small wonder Harkon's Legion spotters hadn't adapted in time. The Terrans had given them none. When Patel's HUD lit up, she could see that he had a full view of every legionary in front of him. He didn't take cover, as there was nothing on this moon that could shield his massive silhouette. Lights burst along the line as he took a volley of fire. Most missed as he charged them in an angled jump. The few that landed merely disappeared into his steel plates. The legate, riding along inside his mind, knew that all these streaks of light should have been hitting the advancing Klaxian. This single action alone upsetting the carefully choreographed dance perfected in her empire's war rooms. Her legion had lost. It just didn't know it yet. Mid-air, he lined up a shot with his HUD, apparently linked to the sights of his weapon, and Harkon felt the recoil in his bones. The simulation was too fast for Harkon, but she knew whatever he had been aiming at was gone. She had seen what a failed energy shield did to the legionary that had trusted it. Any notion that Patel was just a simple distraction disappeared along with her poor sister. Falling from an almost 16-meter apex, Patel was actually frustrated with the time it was taking to come down. Harkon could understand why all these Terrans seemed to have frightening reflexes. They were accustomed to falling in the ludicrous gravity of their own nuclear hell of a world. Everything that came next was just a blur of movement and gore, with the occasional flash of an overloaded pulse rifle. Harkon was mentally begging him not to load another magazine, and had to watch through his eyes each time another 30 explosions tore through her sisters. 7 minutes it had taken Patel to fire his weapon to depletion. He had been calm in his aim and indifferent to the returning fire. If anything, he seemed to revel in it, and chose to focus his fire on any legionary that had the good sense to fire on the Klaxians Patel had been deliberately covering. A steady stream of communication came in as all four of his unit reported they were empty. Gramps spoke, and they all found craters to kneel in. "Okay, kiddos, I'm all out of stickers for you. I think we did our jobs for today. Keep up with the front, but don't extend. I know what happened with those SDKG-48 clowns, but we don't do that here. Got it? Got it. Patel, something weird is going on in your grid. It looks like they held a legion in reserve and are trying to reestablish that bow shape they started with. I want you to move back a couple 100 meters till we figure out what's going on here." Patel jumped straight up like a coiled spring and took a full look at the situation from over 20 meters above the battle. Harkon could see her own 10th Legion charging. "Gramps, my little lady friends are not going to be able to fall back in time." "That wasn't a request, Patel. Move that tushy back. You know how to handle themselves, or they know how to handle themselves." Patel looked below himself as he came down and saw at least a dozen Klaxians in his own crater trying to hold the rim. He had jumped far too high, and it was taking precious time to come back down. Worse, fast near-vacuum winds were combining with the moon's rotation, were causing him to drift from his launch points. A legionary must have gotten into their flank at some point and was lining up its rifle. Totally oblivious to Patel coming back down like a comet, some cruel fate had caused Patel's shadow to alert her sisters, who had only enough time to look up. Harkon wanted to scream for the legionary to run, but it was too late. She felt Patel's fist drive the legionary into the ground, then through the dust layer, and finally, his armored hand went through both sides of the exoskeleton. She would have died instantly. That was the only mercy now. Patel hadn't done anything like that in his short life. She felt his disgust with himself as his arm shot back to his side. To his horror, the limp body came firmly attached to his elbow. In his panic to free himself, he used his other forearm to shear the corpse off. The Klaxian beside him had turned around to see what impact had shaken the crater, and totally froze in the shadow of his brutality. Patel screamed at the Klaxian to run, but he wasn't in the same channel, and the near vacuum wouldn't have carried even in that sense-shattering roar. Harkon thought the hatchling had been loud, but this was different. Light blanketed Patel's vision as another legionary came over the edge and overloaded a shot straight into the side of Patel's knee. He awkwardly crouched as he pulled the plating apart, and the shot slipped through into his under armor. Patel's world went white, and then Harkon felt his pain. Her own limbs grew back, and there was a limit to how much pain was useful to her. Once that limit had been reached, there was no need to go on. Her body was merciful, while Patel's was not. Anger, fear, rage, and pain. She had felt Patel's mind, and now she felt it vanish. There was no more Patel. The legionary that had fired on him was now floating backwards, with Patel's empty weapon lodged in its thorax. Several more legionaries came over the rim, and shocked by the sight of Patel next to her desecrated sister, began to fire on him. Harkon didn't know where the front line was, because neither did Patel, and his HUD may as well have been off because he didn't seem to look through it in an effort to fixate on his attackers. Harkon may not have been able to close his first eyelids, but her mind seemed to shelter her from the worst of what she was seeing. Legionnaire faces froze in horror as Patel launched himself at them, sometimes using one to bludgeon the other. When Patel finally threw himself at the 10th legionary, he didn't seem to understand what had happened. The blast had knocked him far higher than he had been jumping to this point. He came down hard this time. His knee might not have been broken, but the frame of his armor kept him upright. His knee might have been broken, but the frame of his armor kept him upright. Patel and Harkon were now deaf, and their vision was reduced to a tunnel searching for their tormentors. He took another 2 blasts before he gave up and simply sat down. Moldy arrived first. To Patel's clouding eyes, she seemed like some sort of Valkyrie hurtling down between the rays of an unnamed star. She had to drive her foot through the ground just to slow her body down when she landed. Patel, what the fuck? What the fuck? Patel is down! Patel, what the fuck? Gramps! Patel couldn't hear her, but the recording seemed to overlay the communication channel onto the recording for Harkon. Harkon felt Patel's mind finally creep over the pain. He looked into Moldy's face and smiled. I'm okay. Just the little bitches with the boxes on their hips. Don't touch them, okay? Harkon was all of a sudden aware that at some point Patel had bitten a piece of his own tongue off. It was hard to believe Moldy could have made out what he said. Moldy's face went blank. The tutor simply told Harkon she was in a null emotional state. Through Patel's fading vision, she watched Moldy pick up a Klaxian from behind and rip it in half. She then threw one half of the charging legionary, and it vanished. Patel and Harkon both faded out, and Harkon's vision came back to see Bay passed out on the table. Harkon physically couldn't sweat, cry, or vomit, but the aftershock of what she had just experienced had made her mind do all three. She settled for sliding off her platform and letting the crushing gravity wash over her. These Terrans lived in this pain every day of their tortured lives. She could still see the female Terran's face before it turned its back on Patel. For the first time tonight, Harkon was certain that she knew more than the tutor's null state description. That wasn't what it was. That was the last face a trillion beings were going to see if she didn't stop this madness. Harkon needed time, and she needed space. She crawled back to her platform and guided it away from Dr. Wombei Chen, who now somehow seemed so small. A tiny queen with a tiny brood from a tiny population of creatures who called a single dying planet home. The Terrans that didn't grant her the title of doctor were fools. She was the wisest of them all. The Calaxian had their own trouble, and she had put all their hopes on these creatures, and had put all their hopes on these creatures who had no right to call themselves a war race. It wasn't their fault. They couldn't have known what they had traded for when they had been asked. Each single Terran had far too much at stake to be used as a trial combatant. All the war races in the galaxy were hive species, born ready to die for their brood as long as the queen prospered. These Terrans were born to kill to ensure everything they loved lived. Harkon's entire life had been for war, but she now understood that the galaxy only knew it as a game. These Terrans had to be saved from themselves, or the galaxy was going to burn along with them. Harkon went back to the hatchling's chamber and saw it sleeping, just like its father. Harkon now understood that the fate of an entire brood was in that one hatchling. Bay had taken her here to save the Empire's legions from certain death. Harkon was going to repay her if she had to march her own brood into the Empire's Queen of Queens hives. She left the room and took the tutor off the table with the still sleeping Bay. She covered her with a piece of textile she had found, and the tutor had shown her was appropriate. She then downloaded Bay's entire library, including the footage, history, song, and movies. The tutor had no trouble performing its tasks. Harkon felt guilty for taking it, but she was going to need it for her mission. Slightly less noble, perhaps, Slightly less noble, perhaps, but for reasons she didn't understand, she decided to enter the feeding chamber and take 2 remaining cells of royal jelly. By the time she had returned to her shuttle bay, the tutor had summoned her shuttle using Bay's authority and the tutor's total disregard for authorization protocols. The steward Tally didn't dare stop a legate who had the audacity to click her mandibles like a young princess. Epilogue. Less than 4 years after their discovery by the Calaxian League, the Terrans had managed to join and then be removed as a war race, designated species by the Galactic Council. In principle, the resource allocation system had been designed to ensure the Galactic Assembly compensated the war races to maintain their readiness and to stop them from ever truly instigating a full-scale conflict. That purpose had been wise when it had been written eons ago, but it could not have predicted the Terrans. In recognition of the Terrans' value as a war race, but the devastating results of including them in trials, they were instead paid to maintain their own peace. Should a time ever come when an outside force threatened the galaxy, they would be called. The act became known as the Terran Deterrent. All of them were instigated by a legate that somehow matured into a minor queen halfway through her life cycle. She had unwavering commitment gone so far to instigate a mutiny on a small trial conflict fleet and took it to the heart of her own empire to demand an audience with her own Queen of Queens. The legate had offered its own head on the condition her queen experienced the story of a Terran named Muldy. The queen declined her head after bearing witness to the rage of Muldy. She instead petitioned the Galactic Council for the expulsion of the Terrans and their immediate designation as a unique race. An amendment to the war trial system ensured that the Terrans were well compensated to find other ambitions. They slowly spread out from their dying world and happily settled planets deemed inhospitable for the rest of the races. In time, the Terrans would become valued members of the Council, skilled diplomats, traders, artists, and healers. but they would never again play in the war games the races of the rest of the races dabbled. In principle, they would only intervene in the events of an external war or internal civil war, but this has never come to pass.